No.
Did anybody ever play the game Crack the Egg?
Oh,
Yes.
So fun.
This is unbeatable. Like literally, it is completely unbeatable.
That's what I did.
You're
too.
right.
And you can like hold the knees.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're-
But what
you're
is the
safe.
egg? I forget.
Do anything.
We'd always play popcorn. Yeah.
Okay, but
Popcorn.
this is a special kind of egg. It's like a poached egg.
Cheese.
Or like what is it? It's a hard-boiled egg, as it were. Remember that metaphor I used for you on the first day of class, if you were there, involving this, full lotus metaphor. You probably didn't get it at the time. But I think I can explain it better now. It connects to this. And I'm going to ask for your thoughts in a little bit, so keep those. But the problem with this, right, and here's the metaphor, right, here's the Zazen parable, as I put it, is that if you sit like this, right, and you've got your ankles on your thighs like this, if you're not used to it, it will create a level of muscle tension in you that you're not used to. But here's the thing about muscle tension is that it's always there, but it's only when you exaggerate it that it becomes noticeable. And it's only when it becomes exaggerated and noticeable and therefore painful that you are able to release it. That's the key, right? So the metaphor, right, is that it's like, oh, this is really, really tense. I wish I could release it. Why can't I just release it? Why am I not allowed to release it? It's like, oh. Now that's what peace feels like. I forgot, right? And then it's like, then you have released the tension that is always built up in you. And then in that sense, you will just rediscover peace. And I figured out a better way to articulate what I meant by that, which is that, well, what is muscle tension? Muscle tension is inappropriate force in a certain sense. And when we talk about privilege, right, we've talked about privilege a few times, in a certain sense, that's what that is it's baggage hitched onto your action that has an effect on the people you act toward, but not on you, in a certain sense, right? And so in a certain sense where there's little leeches, little parasites hitching a ride on your action that you don't see, but the people for whom the action is received do experience it. You're unconscious, but they experience your unconsciousness consciously. And that's muscle tension, right? It's something you're unconscious of in everything you do. But what happens if you do this, right? In this sense, you're not only, because you are in full lotus pose, you're not only acting with more force than you need to, you're also receiving the action with more force than you need to. So you not only act more forcefully, but you are hurt more forcefully because you're acting more forcefully. And then you realize that the pain you're causing to others is the pain you're causing yourself, in a certain sense. And then because there's so much pain, and you're causing the pain, you just stop doing the pain. And then you feel peaceful. In a certain sense, that's the idea of karma in certain Eastern traditions, is that to the extent that you hurt others, you're hurting yourself. And that all hurt is hurt, in a certain sense. And I was thinking about that recently, and this has to do with forgiveness. I'm going to get to this. Because Prospero forgives his betrayers at the very end. And it seems odd. It seems uncharacteristic of him, especially considering the responses that a lot of you gave about Prospero at the beginning, because we think of forgiveness as a good thing, but he forgives them, which is interesting. The interesting thing about forgiveness is that, who's heard of the Rwandan genocide? What happened? Anybody know? Anybody want to say? Go ahead.
A certain government faction took over the government. I can't remember what the exact cultural divide was.
Hutus that attacked the Tutsis? Hutus killing Tutsis.
I can't remember what the other
They're
two.
different
Tutsis and
tribes.
Hutus.
Is that it?
Yeah, and they're two different tribes.
But one took control of the government and basically forced a genocide, like
They took control of the government because Britain withdrew.
this other
That's the
cultural
problem.
group that was very well previously integrated into society. So everybody knew someone who was Nazi or
And who accomplished the genocide?
regular people.
Regular people. That's the idea. Who's heard of Humans of New York? You know about that. For a while, he went to Rwanda and he did interviews with the people there. And one of them was the president of Rwanda currently. And he said that what we had to do to to maintain peace was to unilaterally forgive everybody, because otherwise the strife would continue. And it was interesting reading the comments on that, because there was generally two groups. People who said that's awful, you are putting the burden on the oppressed, you're putting the burden on the victim, how dare you? And the other people were saying, you don't know what forgiveness is like. Forgiveness is not for the other person, it's for you. It takes away the burden. But what was interesting is that the people who criticized that mode for putting the burden on the oppressed generally had nothing to do with the situation. They were white people in America. And the people who advocated the other position, saying forgiveness is for you, actually had practical experience with it. Forgiveness is a medicine, not to heal the other person, not to relieve them of guilt, but to relieve you of the burden of hatred. That's what forgiveness does. Jesus says, bless them that curse you and despitefully use you. I'm probably butchering it, but it's like, agree quickly with thine adversary. Go 2 miles with he who would compel you to go 1, right? Why do we do that? Well, one reason is that if we didn't do that, we would bury the burden of resentment. We would bear the burden of resentment. And we would bury the burden, and it would act out in everything we do. But if we forgive them, we say, I don't want to keep holding this anymore, right? Here's the interesting thing about strife and contention. Because in 3rd Nephi, Jesus says, contention is not of me, it is of the devil. And if you read the Book of Mormon very carefully, you'll notice that the main sin at all seems to be some kind of accusation in a certain sense. If you have negative thoughts, and I'm sure you all do, those negative thoughts will have the character of accusation. They will say, how dare you think this thought? How dare you be this weak, this fat, this stupid, whatever. They're accusations. They are blame. They're shame. But what's interesting is that, well, this is from my experience anyway. Fighting back against those thoughts doesn't work. And here's why. Because insofar as you fight back against those thoughts in your head, you are insisting that it matters, say, whether you're fat or not, right? Or whether you're stupid or not, or smart or whatever, right? You're playing the game on the thought's own terms. And then you let them win as a result. But more than that, what you'll notice if you pay attention to negative thoughts is that they are not trying to get you to believe something. They're trying to get you to feel something. I've mentioned in previous class that there was a psychiatrist who did a little private statistical analysis of the voices that the voices would what the voices would tell people to do. He would interview the voices of schizophrenic patients through the patient. And one thing that he found out several things, but one thing he found is that the voices tended to tell people to use drugs, specific drugs, in proportion to how bad the withdrawal of the drug was. Not how pleasurable the drug was. The voices didn't want pleasure. They wanted to witness the suffering of the person through the withdrawal. And that's interesting. Because it seems as if, well, first of all, there's no practical utility in that kind of psychological mechanism. For instance, why do people commit suicide? What evolutionary advantage does that have? I can't think of it. I'm not arguing against evolution. That's not what I'm doing. I'm saying there's other factors here in addition. And one thing that is fascinating to me is that negative voices, which are really just an exaggeration of what happens in schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is an exaggerated version of this. They don't want you to think what they're telling you. They want you to feel bad because of it. They want you to feel pain and shame and worthlessness and fear. And they're using the thoughts just as an excuse to get you to feel those things. But I was wrestling with that this morning, and I kind of came to a conclusion, kind of a solution, actually, which is that, let's say a voice is telling me, like, you're an awful person, right? Or you're stupid, or you're evil. I had the epiphany that maybe I should just believe them. And this is shocking. But I believed that what they were saying was right, but I believed also that whatever they said had nothing to say about my worth or my safety. So let's say a voice tells you, you're worthless, you're awful, right? Or let's start with something more simple, like saying, you're stupid for failing that test. You would tell the voice saying, you're right, actually. Maybe I am stupid, but it's okay to be stupid, right? At that point, the voice has no power over you. Because the voice is not trying to get you to believe something, it's trying to get you to feel something. And to the extent that you don't let it have that effect, it will just leave. It will just leave, and this happens. Or, for instance, let's say someone is saying, you're evil, right? The voice is saying, you're evil. Like, this is something that happens in my head a lot. It's kind of extreme and kind of ridiculous. Kind of funny, too. Another thing is that you can really laugh at your negative thoughts. That's something really valuable to do. That's what Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban is about in the Boggart, is that Satan has no sense of humor. He can be cynical. He can be witty. But he doesn't have the ability to laugh at himself. If you laugh at your negative thoughts, they will go away like that. Laugh at them, not mocking, right? Because then you're acting out the negativity, but you laugh at how ridiculous it seems that the person who has no future is saying you have no future, right? Think about that for a little bit. Right? And so, in that sense, one thing you can do with negativity is to simply say, you're right. I am worthless, and yet that doesn't affect my worth. Sounds paradoxical, right? But if you let the intellectual idea that you have no worth, if you entertain that thought while not entertaining the feeling of worthlessness, they have no power over you. Sever those two. Sever what they're saying with how you feel. It's complicated, but you can kind of get to the point where you're like, I agree with you, but that doesn't change how I feel. Right? So if we're talking about the Tempest, what's interesting is that Prospero forgives. And he manipulates all these people, right? We talked about that last time. And he gets all this set up to have a marriage, but also he isn't seeking for vengeance. It's not at all. He maybe wants to go home, but he's not out to get people to be hurt. Not lastingly, anyway. And so it makes me wonder, what does want us to be hurt? What does want to hurt? And we call that factor Satan, right? We call that factor the devil, the father of all lies, the father of all these negative thoughts, the father of all contention, of strife. And believe in Satan or not, probably should if you're here, right? I mean, you can believe all sorts of things here, but there is an undeniable psychological fact that the devil exists. The devil is an undeniable psychological reality, and if you don't think so, you're not paying attention. Because the devil is the thing that says you can do it one more time, and it won't matter. The devil is the one who says you're worthless. The devil is the one who says being is worthless, so you might as well shoot up a high school to show people how worthless it is. Because that's what people do with the school shootings, right? They have become convinced that being is worthless. They have become convinced that there is no meaning to life. They have become convinced that humanity is not worth saving. So they demonstrate it in a certain sense. That's one way to look at it. But here's the thing about the devil, though, is that if the devil is an undeniable psychological reality, what do you do with him? That's the question. Do you fight him? That's one way to think about it. But the problem with fighting the devil as we normally think about it is that insofar as you fight the devil, insofar as you fight these impulses of negativity, he's already won. Because to that extent, he is determining the game. And you see this in our culture. Holy cow. I was reading the preface for Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Who's heard of it? Anybody? Yeah, it's a provocative book. And one of the things he says there are 3 lies that we bought into as an American culture in this generation. One is that what doesn't kill me makes me weaker. That's the first one. The idea that difficult, life-threatening things should be avoided because they will make you weak. That's the first thing. Second thing is that the world is divided between good and evil people. And I don't remember the third one, but oh well. But the second one is what I wanted to get to. The second one, the idea that the world is divided between good and evil people. Is that true?
No.
I don't think it is. Because I don't think people are good or evil. I think impulses are good or evil. Here's why. Let's say the guy I study, Emanuel Swedenborg, have I talked to you about him extensively?
Not yet.
Not in this class, okay. So he was an 18th century scientist in Sweden. Funny it should be in Sweden, right? Who, in the middle of his life, started having waking dreams and visions that turned into a 24-hour living, continuous experience of heaven and hell, actually. Here's the thing about Swedenborg. He anticipates and corroborates most of what we teach in the church. And while some of it Joseph Smith could have known, he probably didn't. A lot of it he didn't and couldn't have known. Because the books weren't available, they weren't even published. They were just in a desk in Stockholm at the time. A lot of the stuff that goes on in the temple, for instance. One thing he says is that, and this is really valuable, to the extent that we assume that the impulses that happen in us are from us, we are sinning. Whether those impulses are good or evil. Because if we take credit for the good, we are sullying what belongs to God with our own sense of self-importance. But if we take credit for the evil, we are insisting that something that's flowing into us belongs to us and taking guilt where we shouldn't. And so what he suggests is that we simply let the impulses be what they want to be and don't own them. Which is complicated because in a certain sense you do own them once you act them out. But there is a level of being at which, in a certain sense, you simply let action happen and you don't own it. Because, my legs are getting tired. We talked about this with Montaigne, this little word I. And in a certain sense, this works with nouns more generally. To the extent that I was thinking about this earlier, and let's say that I hate you, right? Let's say I hate all of you, for instance. Let's say I have a thought in my head that I hate you, right? No, but like, here's the thing, right? Because I'm saying that, you're assuming I mean it. What if it just came out? What if I didn't mean it? What if it just expressed itself? Well, here's the thing about I, is that whenever I say I, XXXX, I'm owning something. At least that's how we normally attribute it. And to me, this is one of our biggest problems as a culture, is that we assume that the impulses that belong to us and that act themselves out through us all belong to us in a certain sense. Well, we need to be responsible for them, legally as well as spiritually. If we insist that the things we do belong to us, ultimately, undeniably, and inextricably, you're never going to get rid of the bad parts. Right? It's like if somebody, I see this all the time, if somebody says, you're awful, I hate you for doing this, the other person will often, not always, take the terms of the argument and say, I did this, yes, and I hate you for saying I shouldn't be allowed to do this, right? And it's like, maybe it wasn't me that was doing this. Maybe it was something in me, right? And if that's the case, and if I can watch it, because this is mindfulness, right? If I am mindful of the activities that I'm doing, suddenly they're not me, and I can let them go, right? That's the tricky thing, is that, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be responsible. I'm not saying you shouldn't repent for the bad things you've done, because in a certain sense, this is what repentance is it's letting the dead wood be cast off because you realize it doesn't belong to you. Not owning something that you don't need to own. Because here's a tricky thing, and this is very relevant in the church. Shame and sin are two sides of the same coin. Shame and sin. Shame, in a certain sense, reinforces sin. And sin reinforces shame. Why? Because insofar as you sin, you're hiding from something. To me, that's what sin is. It is the attempt to hide from the truth and of what you should be doing. And shame says, in a certain sense, you're awful for doing that, which makes you want to hide even more. Right? They're connected. And I'm sure you've all had experiences with this, because we can't not. It is the human condition. But it connects to the Tempest, right? Because he forgives. He forgives them and he ends a cycle. I've talked about this before, but this is a pattern you see often, which is that in abusive families, abusive households, the abused can become the abuser. Often does, not always. I don't want to make a generalized statement. You're not bad because you've been abused, although you probably think you are. That's a common pattern. It's not true. One way you can think about why that is, and this is interesting, is because often, you think about this for a little bit. Rape victims often feel guilt when they have no logical reason to. This is a very, very common pattern. Why is that the case? I've heard it said, and I've not been raped, although a lot of men are raped, more than you think. I've heard it said that an idea that it's the opposite pole of the fact that the rapist often feels no guilt whatsoever. Perhaps, this person says, in a pathological, disturbing way, the rape victim is experiencing the guilt that the rapist refuses to feel. That's shocking and terrifying, but maybe it's true. And that would explain the facts. Because we feel guilt, and if guilt is the other side of sin, it can be split in different ways. And it's complicated, right? But like, maybe this can explain why abuse gets passed on in different situations, because we have the shame of guilt that we don't want to look at. So we keep passing it along to the next generation for them to look at it. Something like that. I don't know. But guilt isn't shame, though, is the thing. Maybe I'm using guilt in the shame way, but there's another sense in which guilt means something different. Because godly sorrow, right, it's tied in with repentance. I had the intuition the other day that godly sorrow, what it is it's feeling a deep sense of helplessness, a deep sense of incapacity, because everything you do on your own will continue the pattern. And a realization out of a deep helplessness, you can't do it on your own. There needs to be something else, something extra that flows in. And here's the tricky thing. Often, in fact always, I would suggest, that grace comes in the moment when you realize that helplessness, when you really realize it. That grace, that divine assistance comes when you see your weakness, to quote the Book of Mormon, and you are made strong. Because we are all weak, and in a certain sense, it is our capacity, our tendency to say, no, I'm not weak, that is the cause of sin. Adam and Eve, I've heard suggested, their sin was not to partake of the fruit. That was a transgression. Their real sin, says a Latter-day Saint theologian named Blake Ostler, was to hide before God. was to feel like they needed to hide themselves, to not be vulnerable before God. It's like, no, we didn't do this. We didn't do this, right? No, I'm fine. No sin here. No transgression here, right? But it's the covering. It's the shame. And that shame is the human condition, right? We are afraid. What's interesting is that the leading cause of death for transplants, people who have had organ transplants, is actually infection because they're not taking their medication. Over half of them die because they're not taking their medication. And you think, well, that's just because people are lazy. I actually don't think that's the case. And here's why. This never happens with pets, for instance. Pets always get their medication regularly, but we don't give ourselves the medication. Why would that be the case? Well, one possible reason could be that we have seen our weakness, or we don't want to see our weakness, and we know that we are terrible people, that we have the capacity to sin, that we have the capacity to hurt, that we have the capacity to be evil, and we know that, and we don't know that about other people, perhaps. Maybe the reason why we don't medicate ourselves when we need to is because we know deeply through our own introspection that how awful we are in our own estimation, right? And we feel shame and we want to hide. But here's the thing, like I was alluding to with the thought about believing the thought but not believing it affects your word. What if you are depraved? I'm not saying you are. What if you are completely, awfully sinful and evil? What if God loves you anyway? What if God would help you and save you the moment you admitted that? I don't know. It's a hypothesis, but what if the moment you admitted you are completely helpless without him? Not only helpless, but completely vulnerable, not only to other people's hurting you, but to you hurting yourself? What if at that moment, when you realize and admit that to God, or to some person who represents God, at that moment you realize that there's nothing to be afraid of, because God is always there willing to help you as long as you ask for it. This has kind of gone far afield, but in another sense it hasn't. Because what is Antonio doing? Antonio and Sebastian and all those folks. They are villainizing someone. They're making him a villain and turning him into a villain and inviting Prospero to villainize them, but he doesn't do it. And it's because, I suggest, because maybe one reason is because Prospero knows that the evil in him, how do I put this? Prospero knows that evil is not something that belongs to people, but is something that lives in people, or something like that, right? And it is something that we can free us from, not by attacking the evil people, right? Because that's Sauron, right? Looking everywhere for the person to blame with the eye that never looks inward. But instead, saying that I have the capacity to be pained and to hurt, and so I'm going to let it go. Like in Zazen, right? Like what I did is the tension, you just let it go, both legs. Muscle tension, just let go. Just abandon the whole thing, right? And so forgiveness is really, really powerful. I also want to talk about what this has to say about dreams, right? How many of you dream regularly? Okay, a number of you, a good number of you. Dreams are a major theme in this play, actually. Dreams are, in a certain sense, what does it say? We are the stuff that dreams are made of. Yeah, dreams are made on, technically, but yeah, that's the idea. We are the stuff that dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Have you ever thought that, let me put it this way. People are afraid of becoming nothing after death, right? People are afraid of losing their identities and their consciousness. And there's good reason to think you won't, but even if you do, and I don't think you will, it isn't a problem because that happens every 24-hour cycle. There is a time in every sleep where there is no dreams, no memory, just void. There's nothing, right? And that happens every single day to each one of you. I don't think people think about that enough. Our little life is rounded sleep. And in between those periods of blackness are dreams. Dreams are interesting because if you get people, because dreams are kind of what happens when you have the rapid eye movement sleep. If you wake people up right as they're doing rapid eye movement and just let them sleep the other times, they will start to hallucinate within days, really badly. There is a sense in which dreams are necessary for psychological well-being. We need dreams to function. I have a friend who's a neuroscientist, and he dug through an old neuroscientific book, and he found this idea that, and it's complicated, and I've never heard anyone else say this in this context, in other contexts, and I'll get to that, but he said that there's an idea, neuroscientifically, that perhaps dream consciousness evolutionarily preceded waking consciousness. That at one point, we were dreaming all the time, that we perceived, and we were dreaming while we perceived, and then that sense went away. That's an idea that I've heard before. It's something that, for instance, Swedenborg said, the guy I mentioned, he said that the state of the Garden of Eden represents a state where the spiritual world was present in the physical world, like a person's emotions are present in their face. Because you don't see a person's emotions like, you see it in their face, but you kind of have to read it. You kind of have to, something appears to you there, imaginatively, instantly, like a gestalt. And he says that that used to be the case with the whole world. You could see the spiritual world in the physical world like the meaning in the pages of a book. That's since changed. Rudolf Steiner, another guy I studied, who was kind of a spiritual teacher in the early 20th century, he said that in the previous phases of humanity's evolution, he said that we were like someone who didn't have a clear image of the sensory world because we were dreaming. And that's fascinating to me because this person said the same thing without me having to ask them, right? Our little life is rounded with a sleep. Maybe it's not regular waking consciousness that's the default. Maybe this is the exception. Maybe, just maybe, the clear, precise waking consciousness of humanity is an experiment. Maybe the real world isn't like that at all. Maybe it's more like a dream. And here's one way to think about that. Where do you get the idea that the world you see is complete as it looks to you? Right? Because it's like, let's say I have a vase of flowers here, right? But moreover, let's say that I have a seed for like a tulip or something, right? I look at the seed, right? It's a certain thing. But then I put it in the ground, and then it becomes something else. It unfolds into something else. And it becomes something else if I